Top boxing news.
Okay, and now it's time for our weekend recap. Lots of fights to cover. We'll start with the IBF bantamweight title fight between domestic rivals Ebony Bridges, the champion, and Shannon O'Connell, the challenger.
I told you Ebony Bridges ain't no fucking gimmick.
I told you they don't call her the blonde bomber for nothing. I told you that Shannon O'Connell is quite susceptible to the looping right hand, mid-range to inside. And apart from an early scare that Ebony suffered in the first round, visibly being hurt by one of Shannon's right hands,
That aside, Ebony Bridges bossed it.
battered Shannon O'Connell.
In the build-up of this match, I saw a lot of people going with Shannon.
Oh yeah, and I'm sure that those individuals have found themselves a nice spot to sit in somewhere under a rock.
Boxing is an emotional sport for the fighters, for their teams, and for the fans. And I think that a lot of people let their emotions get in the way.
When it comes to Ebony, I feel like there's a lot of people that made a decision within themselves that they're not going to give her a break. They're not going to give her a chance. They're not going to give her any credit.
Because of the contrasting ideologies between Ebony and some others.
Those individuals who are more focused on that than the actual pugilism, the actual boxing. I told you that Ebony Bridges is a capable mid-range to inside pressure fighter that packs a big punch. And Shannon O'Connell, she found that out the hard way.
Let's talk about what we saw in the early goings of the match. You saw Ebony Bridges closing the distance, closing the gap, powering forward, and she was on the receiving end of a few right hands. Hard
Though
ones.
she still had the right game plan, the right strategy. Ebony Bridges being the shorter, stumpier fighter, there wasn't much chance of her winning this thing from the outside, so she knew she's got to close the distance and close the gap to get mid-range to inside.
That's her sweet spot. That's where she does her best work.
After having suffered an early scare in the first round, Ebony recovered, regained her composure and her footing, and proceeded to stick to the plan. Close the gap on Shannon and put her on her back foot. Crowd her.
Because Shannon O'Connell, she ain't no good on her back foot. She needs a bit more room and real estate to get off her power shots than Ebony does because she's a taller, longer fighter than Ebony.
Her punches are wider and she needs more room to throw them, more room to deliver them, whereas Ebony, mid-range to inside, deep in the pocket, she has the advantage as the smaller, stumpier fighter with the shorter arms and the shorter punches.
It was a short, albeit powerful, right hand in the heat of the exchange between the shots that put Shannon O'Connell down in the third round.
Very dramatic moments in the third round that harken back to the Bianca Elmire fight from 3 years ago.
Bianca, like Ebony, was a shorter, stumpier fighter with a lower center of gravity who had a quality right hand. And in that Bianca Elmire fight, Shannon O'Connell couldn't stay out of the way of that right hand in yesterday's fight.
Once again, Shannon O'Connell was on the receiving end of a lot of right hands. Big ones, mid-range to inside.
A very messy fight, a physical fight that does not favor the older, more war-torn fighter. And that fighter really is Shannon O'Connell, pushing the pace.
Ebony Bridges effectively sapped Shannon O'Connell's energy reserves. After 3-4 rounds, you could see Shannon was spent, hurt several times en route to being stopped.
Ebony Bridges barreled forward, crowding Shannon O'Connell, pushing her around, unloading shots and wearing on her energy reserves, wearing on her gas tank.
A deliberate attempt to smother Shannon O'Connell's work as to not give her enough room and real estate to add torque, to add power to her punches, whilst at the same time overwhelming her with volume.
A physical fight don't favor the older fighter.
A rough and tumble fight. You know, Shannon O'Connell is more accustomed to being the biggest puncher in the room, opposite the ring fighters like Shernika Johnson or Taylor Robertson. Finesse fighting kind of fighters that ain't big punchers, but Ebony, they don't call her the blonde bomber for nothing. She can punch.
Yeah, Shannon might be a shotgun, but Ebony's a bomb.
Hindsight being 2020, in spite of all of Shannon O'Connell's big talk, Ebony Bridges had an easier time with her than she had with Maria Cecilia Roman, the then IBF champion, the fight before that.
Hindsight being 2020, Ebony had a harder time with Melis Gangloff, the fight before that, than she had opposite the ring Shannon yesterday.
In spite of all of Shannon's big talk and bad intentions.
You know, she convinced herself that Ebony was a gimmick, that Ebony's just a skanky stripper, she ain't got nothing to worry about.
She'll beat her easy because Ebony's just a fraud and she ain't got no morals. But it was Shannon O'Connell who was quite the ungracious sportswoman post-fight, flipping Sky Nicholson, her countrywoman and amateur standout, flipping her off, flipping her the bird.
Of course, she was rooting for Ebony. Shannon's a sore loser. That's no surprise.
The modus operandi seems to have been overwhelm Shannon O'Connell with activity, with volume, while simultaneously smothering her.
Don't give her room to throw, because when she has a bit of room, she can punch.
She can drive the shot. Don't give her enough room to do that. Back her off, put her on her back foot, and look to land the looping right.
She's a sucker for it. We saw that in the Elmire fight.
Slip and slide your way in.
Catch and shoot if you can. Catch and shoot if you have to.
Batter this old bird. Ebony Bridges put on a career best performance against one of her biggest critics, if not her biggest critic, Shannon O'Connell.
All of Ebony's haters and naysayers will likely pour their hopes into someone else now, some other fighter,
to avail them from eating a big slice of humble pie, because I saw a lot of people getting behind Shannon O'Connell.
people that didn't really seem all that interested in Shannon up until Shannon started bad-mouthing Ebony.
Well, you backed Shannon. How do you like them apples?
Ebony Bridges' attention now turns to unifying this division, and it's going to be a very big 2023 for the Blonde Bomber, who now has bigger fish to fry.
Congratulations to her on her maiden defense of the blue belt, the IBF title. We then come to the main event of that same card, the Josh Warrington versus Luis Lopez IBF featherweight title fight, where the title ended up changing hands, and I didn't think that would happen. You know, at the last minute,
I, like many of you, when this fight was announced, decided to go with Lopez, but at the last minute, fight week, I decided to go with Warrington on the premise that I don't think Luis Lopez is as destructive a puncher as Mauricio Lara, who stopped Josh Warrington.
I didn't think Luis's power was on the level with that guy's power. I figured, you know, if Josh Warrington can make it to the final round and hear the final bell, he can perhaps eke out a decision with a bit of home field advantage. Lest we forget, this fight took place in Leeds, Josh's neck of the woods.
I'm actually surprised Luis Lopez got a fair shake.
Because I'll be honest, in the early goings of the match, at least for me, the rounds were a bit difficult to score because Luis was definitely the busier fighter, throwing more punches, though he wasn't necessarily the more effective fighter. Many of those punches were blocked and some outright missed.
In the early goings of the fight, you saw Josh Warrington trying to implement a bit of catch and shoot, a passive approach intended to...
He wanted to work off the counter, try and use Luis Lopez's aggression and very wide punches against him to get off some counter shots. And that was working for a while. He snapped Luis Lopez's head back a couple of times. You know, Luis Lopez, he's the kind of fighter who's athletically gifted. So much so that he compromises defense for offense based on what his body allows him to do. You know, his speed, his ferocity, the fact that he's a bouncy guy.
Luis is the kind of fighter that substitutes basic fundamentals for athletic ability.
He's not actually fundamentally sound, and depending who's opposite the ring, he can get away with it, continue to get away with it. Opposite the ring fighters like Gabe Flores, a young pubescent fighter who still hadn't really developed as a man, let alone a fighter. Opposite the ring of Josh Warrington, who's a pretty good guy, solid, but not the biggest puncher. You can get away with having your chin in the air like that when the guy's not a knockout puncher.
Early goings of the match, we saw Josh take a passive-aggressive approach, catch and shoot, working off the counter, and it worked for a while, but he started to feel those shots from Lopez, the ones that actually got through.
Josh was a bit passive-aggressive, fighting in spots, fighting off Lopez in spots, bursts of punches, bursts,
salvos that were more or less inconsistent. He fought him off when he could.
But it really wasn't consistent, and after a while, after Luis Lopez's punches, the ones that actually did get through, when they started to take a toll on Josh, you saw Josh trying to smother Lopez, and that's how he found his way into the fight. Won some rounds more decisively by crowding Lopez and making the fight rough and tumble, which is customary in a Josh Warrington fight, clashes of heads.
You know those are going to happen, deliberately or otherwise.
Josh Warrington, as a result, has developed a bit of a reputation as a dirty fighter, a dirty boxer, roughhouse tactics.
And even now, I don't know that Josh Warrington is doing this stuff on purpose. You know, all those clashes of heads that happen in his fights. It could just be as a result of his methodology. The way that he fights, it's bound to happen when you play a guy that close.
But the way that he fights is what got him to a world title 2 times, so he's not about to change it.
A lot of incessant complaining from Luis Lopez to the ref, you know, because of the clash of heads.
A little later on in the fight, he claimed that Josh Warrington, you know, he hit him low.
Josh Warrington, who tried to take a more passive-aggressive catch-and-shoot approach in the early goings of the fight, but as the punches started to take a toll, he decided he's not going to give Luis enough room to get off off those punches, to get off those shots. He'd smother.
And that actually was working towards the tail end of the match. Those were the more decisive rounds for Josh Warrington in this 12-round contest. The rounds where he decided to close the gap on Luis Lopez. Don't give him enough room to throw. Push him around and get off what shots you can. What shots you can get off mid-range to inside.
Don't let him breathe, and don't give him any room, because when he has enough room to throw those shots, he has enough room to put something on him, and those punches hurt.
As stated, I'm surprised that Luis Lopez was able to get a fair shake with the judges, a fair shake in leads, because more often than not, home field advantage results in controversial decisions. Whoever the house fighter is gets maximum consideration, and I was expecting Josh to get maximum consideration.
It's his neck of the woods, where he's a ticket seller, he's the house fighter, the promotion is behind him, Luis is the away fighter.
And even if Luis was a little busier at the start than Josh was, many of Luis Lopez's punches were being blocked, and many of his punches outright missed. So I figured, Josh,
he can eke out a decision.
And if he had, it would hardly be the biggest robbery in the sport of boxing I'd ever seen.
Don't get it in your head that it's over for Josh Warrington. It doesn't have to be if he doesn't want to. He only has one recorded loss in his entire professional record, the loss to Mauricio Lara. There are other fights out there for Josh Warrington.
A potential Lee Wood fight in Nottingham or Leeds almost immediately comes to mind. We know that they're talking about putting Lee Wood in there with Mauricio Lara, but the bigger bang for your buck fight, money-wise, would be Lee Wood versus Josh Warrington. You can do that and make some coin.
Make some money.
It's not just that Josh only has one recorded loss on his record, just one. It's that he actually has options, and he's got some money behind him, so he doesn't have to call it a career off this loss.
As far as Luis Lopez, the newly crowned IBF featherweight champion, I'm already hearing rumors and rumblings about a potential Mick Conlan fight, potential Mick Conlan showdown.
I'd wager that Luis would have to once again get his passport out for that fight, because I don't think Mick Conlan is allowed into the country.
Due to his tenuous associations with alleged cartel kingpin crime boss Daniel Kinahan, one of 600 individuals on a banned list from entering into the United States.
Luis Lopez is a top-ranked fighter. Mick Conlan, he does a bit of business with Frank Warren and BT Sport. Their network relationship, the one between them, they can put that fight together so long as Luis is willing to travel.
Frank and Bob do a lot of business. They can make it happen.
Mick Conlan was in action yesterday, scored a first-round knockout.
It was in Belfast.
He's on the same schedule as Luis Lopez.
Luis, who is this division's newly crowned IBF champion, congratulations to him. He proved me wrong.
Even if I'm still not overly impressed with him. Finally, we come to the main event of the Top Rank show, the super lightweight fight between former unified lightweight champion Teofimo Lopez and the away fighter Sandor Martin. Let's get right down to brass tacks, because this fight has left us with a lot to reflect upon. I saw Sandor win about 4 rounds. 4 rounds decisively. 4 of the 10 tack on the added point from the early knockdown that to me looked a lot like a slip.
It looked more like Teofimo was off balance and lost his footing lunging forward. Caught a shot.
A glancing blow, but it was a blow that grazed him. It didn't look like he went down off the punch. In any event, the ref ruled it a knockdown, so it's a knockdown. And with that, I had Teofimo just eking this thing by a point.
So to a lot of people, a draw would have made more sense.
A draw score would have quelled any outcry of a robbery in the match, though it's not how the judges had it. The judges had it wide in Teofimo Lopez's favor, which is not surprising because Teofimo is the house fighter and Sandor was the back foot, lateral movement, keep away fighter.
The away fighter. It's a bit naive for people to think that you can spend that much time moving lateral.
I don't care how you scored it. More often than not, if you're the away fighter and you spend that much time on the back foot, you're gonna lose.
You're gonna fucking lose.
There's a thin line between creating space and outright retreating. There's a thin line between managing the distance and creating space between yourself and the other fighter and playing keep away all night. It's not a game of freeze tag, it's a boxing match. And some portion of it has to be spent trying to land punches. When you're the guy...
I'm not telling you that Teofimo didn't look bad or that he didn't look limited. He did look limited. He did look frustrated. But Sandor Martin wasn't trying hard enough. He was quite content just keeping away from Teofimo most of the fight.
He wasn't throwing more punches than Teofimo, wasn't landing more punches than Teofimo, he wasn't holding the center of the ring. More often than not, he was the fighter with his back on the ropes. And what do I tell you? You don't end up there on your own. Somebody puts you there. There's a thin line between creating space and retreating.
I say it all the time.
In spite of Sandor Martin's protests and outcry of a robbery, in spite of Teddy Atlas,
Teddy Atlas is more of an MMA guy these days. He's all about the hot takes, outcry of corruption.
it's not corruption. It's consistent within the sport. Whether you're talking about Rigondeaux versus Casemiro or
Conceição versus Valdez. If you're the away fighter, you can't spend that much time on the back foot. You're giving up rounds.
how the fuck is it a sign of dominance that you're spending most of the fight with your back against the ropes? What about putting the other guy's back on the ropes?
Holding the center of the ring.
I'm not telling you that Teofimo won this thing decisively, but I don't want to be too hard on him at the same time because he was opposite the ring, a man who would not engage, a fighter who wouldn't fight. When you're fighting a fighter that's fighting a negative fight, well, it's hard for anybody to look good. The guy's not here to fight, he's here to play freeze tag.
Teofimo ruffles a lot of feathers. He's a polarizing figure in the sport, so it's easy to take shots at him.
As soon as he gives you the ammunition, and based on yesterday's lackluster performance, it's easy for people to say that he got a gift, when the truth is, a lot of guys would look bad opposite the ring Sandor Martin because Sandor don't engage.
He's a spoiler.
Ryan Garcia took it upon himself to take shots at Teofimo, but Ryan Garcia didn't look too hot opposite the ring Emmanuel to go, who fought a very similar fight to Sandor Martin. Emmanuel didn't want to engage either, and Ryan looked lackluster as a result.
Not that Ryan is fighting solid 140-pounders anyway. He's about to fight Mercito Gesta, a lightweight who's moving up to super lightweight for the fight.
He's in no position to talk. The truth is, I told you ahead of time, this is not going to be an easy fight for Teofimo because he's economic and so is Sandor, except Sandor spends the majority of the fight moving lateral. It's hard to look good against a guy like that, but Teofimo was the relatively busier fighter, so that was enough for him to win the fight on activity. Were the scores too wide?
Yeah, they were.
But the right man won.
I don't know what people got it in their heads that you can play freeze tag for 10 or 12 rounds and that's going to be enough to win a decision. You're not just here to avoid punches, you're also here to land them.
And at no point in this fight did Sandor Martin even try to impose his will on Teofimo, so let's just cut the fucking crap.
He didn't throw more than Teofimo, he didn't land more than Teofimo, and he was the guy with his back on the ropes.
I would have been okay with a draw. I think a draw would have made more sense to many, more sense to some, though I'm okay with Teofimo winning by a point. The problem is, the judges had him winning it wide, which creates controversy.
Still, I think the right man won the fight.